Hello, welcome back. For those of you just joining us, this is slot or session 2 of day 1 of on-chain scaling. Our second speaker for the day is Dr. Bob McElrath. Bob's first career was as a theoretical physicist, and he wrote over 30 papers on Higgs bosons, dark matter, black holes, and particle colliders, like the kind at the Large Hadron Collider and CERN. That wasn't nearly interesting enough for him, so he took a left turn into remaking money with cryptography. He is now the CTO and chief scientist of SolidX Partners in New York. He's now working on building an identity platform on blockchain and tutoring bankers about Bitcoin. Bob is an editor of the Ledger Journal. Today, Bob's going to talk to us about braiding the blockchain. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Bob.
All right, thank you very much. So thank you for inviting me. And since you guys have kindly given me one of the first speaking slots, I've decided to give kind of a lengthy introduction to why we have this scaling problem in the first place. I think it's very surprising to a lot of people that we can't just multiply the block size by a factor of 2 and achieve scaling. So I want to go into some detail as to why that is the case and what is really the underlying problems. Let's see here. So why is simple scaling so hard? Bitcoin is the first Satoshi-derived coin to achieve 1,500 transactions per block. We really can't compare to any other cryptocurrency in this realm. Lots of other currencies have messed around with the proof of work function or block time, but none of them have achieved this kind of transaction rate. So what we're beginning to see right now is kind of the breakdown of Satoshi's design as it scales to higher transactions. And the basic problem is that the chain cannot tolerate multiple writers. So one of the things I'll be talking about, and this is the point of a braid, is that we have to move to a data structure that's capable of handling multiple simultaneous writers. The chain structure only allows one block to be attached at the next site, right? It's a single writer kind of data structure. The problem that arises is that blocks become orphaned, and the rate at which this happens is proportional to the validation time and therefore to the block size. Bitcoin has a very serious design flaw. It assumes zero latency, or equivalently, that the network is synchronous. In other words, everybody's supposed to receive the new block all at the same time and add it to the chain all at the same time. Of course, that can't happen. This design flaw leads to a rather serious security problem, and that is called selfish mining. Eyal and Sayer up at Cornell wrote a paper about this a couple years ago, pointing out that this actually reduces the security of the chain from 51%, as we expect, to much lower than that. So this is a serious problem we have to fix. In order to understand this problem, get this next slide. In order to understand this problem, there is something known as the 8 fallacies of distributed computing. If you're bored, I encourage you all to go to YouTube and Google for a talk. There's a very funny talk by this fellow at Sun Microsystems. And he asserted that this is a set of assumptions made by programmers when they first approached distributed computing. And they're all fallacies. And so you can read the 8 of them here. The network's reliable, the latency is 0, the bandwidth is infinite, topology doesn't change, the network is secure, there's one administrator, transport cost is 0, and the network is homogeneous. Of course, none of these things are actually true, and the one that is really hurting us right now is the latency being 0. The latency is not 0. It takes time to transmit blocks. And the bigger the block is, the longer it takes to transmit. It takes time to validate blocks. It takes time to get across the Great Firewall of China. And Peter Dutch stated, these assumptions ultimately prove false, resulting in either the failure of the system or a substantial reduction in system scope, or in large unplanned expenses required to redesign the system to meet its original goals. And that is basically where we stand with Bitcoin today. The sources of latency they come from several places. One is validating blocks. We receive a new block. It's got 1,500 transactions in it. ECC signatures are slow to validate. Even with the new improvements we have with libsecp, it's slow to validate a block. Propagating blocks takes some time. It depends on how much bandwidth you have, but this takes a finite amount of time. There are relay delays. So the NSA and the Great Firewall of China want to inspect your packets, and they delay them for a while as they transit across the internet. There are intentional relay delays. Miners these days are intentionally mining over Tor for a reason to protect themselves against denial of service attacks. And this is actually a desirable source of latency. And last but not least, there's physics. The size of the Earth and the speed of light is a fundamental limitation on how quickly we can communicate from one side of the Earth to the other. And if we want to have an actual global network, we have to take into account that physics isn't going away. It is impossible to remove all sources of latency. We're going to have to redesign the chain to tolerate multiple simultaneous writers. Most of the talks you're going to see are essentially aimed at reducing this latency. We're going to validate blocks faster. We're going to propagate them faster. We're going to have headers first. We're going to have thin blocks, extra thin blocks. But even if we did all of those, there would still be latency. We can't make this latency zero. And it is a flaw in the design that the design wants it to be zero. So let's assume we simply increase the block size. This results in, of course, a decreased number of transactions. And we can write a formula for this. The rate, sorry, I'm trying to read the chat and talk at the same time. I will not read the chat. I'll just talk and answer questions later. Let's assume we simply increase the block size. This results in an increased number of transactions. We can then write the following formula. The transaction rate is the number of transactions we have times 1 minus S, where S is the orphan rate, or the stale block fraction. Today, S is about 1%. But this is directly proportional to the validation time. The longer a block takes to validate, the more likely another block is produced while the nodes are validating and propagating it. Therefore, we can extrapolate this rate, 1% per 1,500 transactions, and we can write the following formula, which is graphed on the next slide. And the tricky thing to see about this is that it actually turns over. So we're living right now at the left edge of this plot, but because the stale blocks don't contribute to the transaction rate, this curve turns over at some point. What happens here is that as you move to the right of this graph, you're spending more and more time validating blocks and less time mining blocks. And at some point, you're spending more time validating blocks than you actually have, more than 10 minutes to validate a block. And so we can, I mean, now we could definitely increase the block size by a factor of 2 and not really have any negative consequences. But this is just kicking the can down the road. There is a much more serious problem looming. And if you take this graph, and extrapolate the total transaction rate at the peak, it's only 125 transactions per second. This is still far less than Visa can accomplish. So why does this happen? So if we go to the next slide, when we add a block, a miner has to choose what to do while he's validating the block, right? So A is the previous chain tip. B is the block I just received. And I have to decide what to do with my miners. I'm either going to tell them to mine on A, the previous chain tip, or I'm going to tell them to mine on B, the next chain tip. So if I choose to mine at A, I run the risk that the block I just received, B, is not valid. There are a lot of reasons a block might not be valid. I think probably the most common would be data corruption in transit. You send a megabyte blob worth of data across the internet, there's a good chance there's going to be a bit flip in there somewhere. This happens. There's a good chance that happened early on in the process and everybody received an invalid block. So you have to basically take block C and mine an empty block. In other words, you're not going to be contributing to the transaction rate anymore because you don't know what's in B yet. And you don't want to have overlapping transactions with it because that would make your block invalid. The other thing you could do is mine against the new block you just received in the hopes that it's valid. And you risk losing if it actually turns out to be invalid. So also in this case, the new block you're mining has to be empty. So we're not contributing to the transaction rate during this time we're validating it. The third choice here is the one I'm talking about for the rest of the talk here, and that is, what if I could mine and validate at the same time? So I want C, I'm going to mine keeping A as the chain tip, and I'm going to mine a new block C while I'm validating B. This should be okay if at some point in the future, another block, D, can come along and say, aha, both B and C are valid. I'm going to tie them up into the same chain. One of the things that has to happen with this is that duplicate transactions have to be tolerated. But this essentially gets at the main point. In order to mine and validate at the same time, blocks have to have multiple parents. That's the essential observation. The point at which increasing the block size actually decreases the number of transactions that can be accepted by the network is around 50 megabytes. This number is very fuzzy. This is not a careful analysis. I'm only trying to point out the fact that this does turn over. I would guess that it's probably closer to 10 megabytes or something like that. I've not included a simulation of the network transmission or propagation delays or anything like that. So we can increase the block size today, but doing it again won't work for very long. The implied maximum transaction rate is only 125 transactions. Visa claims they can process 60,000 transactions per second at peak. And there's a much deeper underlying problem. So the second big problem that I see here is that miners are unwilling to lose blocks. A block costs a lot of money to create, about $15,000. Satoshi, when he originally wrote his paper, assumed that transactions and miners were essentially going to be the same people. You'd run the Bitcoin node on your computer and mine as well as make transactions. That's not the way things have played out. We have an effective separation between miners and people making transactions. And $15,000 is a lot of money. Miners work very hard to not lose that $15,000. And in practice, Satoshi's original design was that you would choose which side of a double spend by the highest work chain. But in practice, miners are selecting among the double spends before they ever get put into blocks. The mempool is already, will reject a double spend. Miners are, in many ways, that you'll hear about in this conference, are trying to synchronize their mempools so that they don't create blocks which conflict with others. So essentially, the double spend is getting selected by a different mechanism than Satoshi's original proposal. And see, of course, the thin blocks and extra thin blocks talks in this conference. So this block size debate hides a much more serious problem, and that is, let's call it miner income asymmetry. That is, there are miners who win a block, and there are miners who do not win a block for doing exactly the same work. A miner runs his node in good faith, computes what a valid block is, adds some transactions, creates a proof of work hash, submits it to the network, and it gets orphaned. If I was a miner and this happened to me, it would probably piss me off. A block is worth $15,000 or so. That's a lot of money. The folks at Cornell pointed out selfish mining and a specific game that you can play to increase your winnings by mining in a hidden way, by hiding your blocks and mining against your own blocks, so you win 2 blocks at a time instead of only 1. I'd go further than this to suggest that any income asymmetry among miners can be exploited and maximizing miner profits at the expense of the security of Bitcoin. We really want there to be the same pay for the same work. So one of the things I want to suggest here is that we move to a model where miners receive equal pay for equal proof of work. Mining today is not, by and large, the means by which we choose double spends. It is the means that we tie the value of the coin to the real-world value. Larger blocks and more orphans increases the temptation to selfish mine because it increases this asymmetry. More blocks get lost, and miners have a temptation to try and not lose those blocks. So let us recognize mining for what it is today. It's the means to couple real-world costs to the coin. It's the way it gets related to dollars. And let us try and move towards something where equal proof of work receives equal pay. So how do we mine and validate at the same time? Simultaneous generation of blocks is unavoidable for a lot of different reasons, all the different latency reasons I showed you. Miners must be able to validate and mine at the same time. It's possible to create a block C, which doesn't contain any conflicting transactions. Because of the peer-to-peer network and the way that works, it's possible that B and C could contain some of the same transactions. But this isn't actually a problem with respect to the UTXO set, because if I see the same transaction twice, it's not a double spend, right? I just saw the same thing twice. It doesn't actually modify the UTXO set. So it's possible to take C and say that this is a valid block and not reject it. In such case, let's call it a sibling. And as I mentioned before, we're going to essentially tie it up by a future block having multiple parents. And of course, if there is a double spend, this is a chain tip as usual, and it gets resolved in the usual way. It's a different chain, different tip. So this brings us to to the topic of braids. If we allow blocks to have multiple parents, this creates a data structure called a directed acyclic graph. One of the ways I like to think about this is, what if I just threw out blocks as fast as I could? Do algorithms exist that can make sense of the chaos and define a highest work tip? The blockchain is essentially oversimplified and inappropriate for the real world asynchronous internet. So what is this thing? Directed means that blocks have parents, and the blocks refer to their parents, but parents don't refer to their children. In other words, the arrows only go one way. Acyclic meaning you can't actually draw a circle. You can't have 3 blocks which point to each other. That is cryptographically impossible. You'd have to break your hash function in order to create a cycle. And it's a graph rather than a chain. A directed acyclic graph can be partial ordered in linear time. And I'm going to show you some Python code in a little bit that actually has these algorithms. We're going to create one more restriction relative to a general DAG. And so I'm going to call this data structure a braid. So let me show you a braid and show you a little bit of the terminology here. So instead of a chain, we're going to have blocks with multiple parents creating essentially diamonds in the middle in certain places. And those diamonds, say B and C, are where 2 blocks got produced at the same time. I'm going to refer to these things as beads rather than blocks in order to make a distinction between what is a Bitcoin block and what is not. I don't want there to be confusion about whether I'm talking about a Bitcoin block or not. So I'm going to call these things beads instead of blocks, but essentially they're the same thing. If 2 blocks appear at the same time and are essentially parallel to each other, we call them siblings. What that means is I cannot time order B and C to say which one came before the other. In other words, if there exists a double span between B and C, I could not decide based upon ordering which one came first. And finally, I'm going to disallow naming an ancestor of one of your parents as a parent. In other words, E is naming both D and B here as his parents, but by association, if he names D as his parents, that also means that he's, by implication, named B as well, because B defines some UTXO set that is already included in D, and so there's no need for E to name B as a parent. So this is not a strict DAG. There is this extra restriction. We're not going to name things as parents that are further up the chain because it's not necessary to do so. What that means is, from a graphical perspective, when you look at these things, you should never see triangles in them. Skip this slide here. So the question then is, what is a Bitcoin block? So if we have a braid with lots of beads coming along, and I want to organize this into a chain, if the bead rate is sufficiently slow, it essentially self-organizes into a chain. So that's the top graph here. This is the blockchain limit. In other words, the difficulty is high, blocks are coming slow, beads are coming slow, and it's easy to organize this. Occasionally, I will get 2 produced at the same time, but I'm allowed to name both of them as parents, and so I can tie them together, and I got a little diamond here on the right side. Let's go the other way. Let's make the difficulty very low, so that there's lots and lots of beads coming, and I still want to organize this. So I still need to somehow create an ordering of these things such that I know which transactions came first. So let me define the concept of a cohort. So a cohort is defined as, oops, I seem to be missing a slide here. All right, a cohort is defined as a group of beads such that it is everything that came before it is an ancestor of everything in the cohort. Everything that comes after it is a descendant of everything that comes in the cohort. In other words, the cohorts define a total ordering. Now, they do so without any additional assumptions. This is purely from the graph structure. The way to think about this is that the boundary between the cohorts, which is the boundary between the colors in the bottom graph here, is where the UTXO set lives. Because of the peer-to-peer relay network, the same transaction might appear in multiple beads here. And when those beads are parallel to each other, when they're siblings, we're going to allow that because I can't time order them. But I can't define I don't have a clearly defined UTXO set. I only get a clearly defined UTXO set at the boundary between these things. So a cohort is going to be the definition or the analog of a Bitcoin block. So we're going to collect together a bunch of beads and put them in a block. This is going to allow us to have a faster block rate with smaller in smaller chunks. This is one way we will achieve scaling with this kind of idea. By having faster blocks, we can process them in a more continuous way. Bitcoin is very spiky, right? You get a block in, and you've got to do a whole bunch of work as fast as you possibly can. And one way to achieve scaling is to spread out this work over the time period of the 10-minute block interval. So I built a simulation of this. So I built a toy model of the Bitcoin network. This code's on GitHub. You're welcome to take a look at it. I'm going to show you some graphs of a 25-node network. Each node has 4 connections. The nodes are randomly distributed on the surface of the Earth. Internode latencies are decided by the arc distance on the surface of the sphere. So this is just Cartesian distance, if you will. My code is in Python. There is another toy model program called Symbit, which I recommend, written in JavaScript if that's better for you. But one of the things I think I would like to see happen, and the conference organizers also would like to see happen, is more analysis, right? There's a lot of speculation happening on Bitcoin Talk and Reddit and places like that, and not a lot of work going into figuring out what things work, actually simulating proposals and testing them. And we all need to be better at testing them. So, all right. So let's take a look at what happens with this thing. So with this 25-node network, this is what's simulated in this slide. The x-axis is the target difficulty, and the y-axis is the cohort time. So on the left edge of this graph, we have essentially a blockchain. And on the right edge of this graph, we have a very thick bead, a very thick braid, so lots and lots of beads coming. So the target difficulty for the left side, this is the target, actually the hash value. So the smaller the hash value, the more difficult the network is. That's the left side. And the right side is the higher target. So this is a faster bead rate. And the interesting thing to notice about this is that this function has a minimum. So I've displayed this simulation here, and the blue line is an actual simulation. The blue line is rather jaggedy, and the green line is a fit, which I'll talk about in a couple slides. This slide is intended so you can see that it is a simulation, but the fit actually is very, very good if you go to the next slide. So this mathematical form for this curve, I'll show you in a second. So this means that there exists a fastest possible cohort time. And if you think about it, this is basically set by the amount of time it takes to propagate some information around the Earth and everybody to just come to consensus about it. And that time interval is kind of a fundamental parameter, a fundamental property of the network. On the left side of the graph, again, is high difficulty. And the beads are produced so rarely that they almost always can be ordered into a chain. And if I look at the right side of the graph, this is the low difficulty limit. My blockchain, my braid, looks like the graph on the top there. And the beads are produced so fast that essentially there's almost always one propagating through the network. So, you know, someone in New York, someone in Tokyo are producing blocks so fast, there's always one in flight. And it's very rare that there's accidentally a quiescent period between the time that beads are produced so that I can perform this total ordering. The nature of binding means that the physics of this is exponentially suppressed. So it's exponentially unlikely that the network's going to quiet down and not produce any beads for a length of time long enough that everybody on Earth can see all the beads that have been produced. So you can throw some math at this. The curve I showed you is given by the following equation. The cohort time is 1 over lambda x, where lambda is the hash rate, plus a e to the a lambda x. A is this network size parameter. It's measured in seconds, so it's a time parameter. This is the amount of time it takes to propagate stuff around the network. It's also roughly the orphan rate. X here is the target hash value. And so given this equation, we can take the blockchain limit and the limit that X goes to 0. So this is a very difficult network, so very small hash values. And what we have is 1 over lambda x plus a. So what we see is that a is the increase in the effective block time due to network latency effects. That is to say, the actual cohort time is slightly longer than expected from the hash rate. And A here are your orphans. So your block time is slightly longer than expected. Other authors have called this minor utilization. Same concept. So we can determine the parameters lambda and A from other things. So lambda is the hash rate. This is the number of beads over X, the target, divided by the cohort time divided by the number of cohorts. In other words, choose an interval of time, count the number of beads that happened in there, that's NB, count the average cohort time, that's TC, and count the average number of beads per cohort. So that's how you can compute lambda. This is just the hash rate. A has a funny form. A is the cohort time times W, where W is the Lambert W function, and the argument to that function is TC over TB minus 1. So we can determine both lambda and A by measuring the network itself. And if you look down below, with these in hand, we can actually find the location of the minimum. So it doesn't matter where you are on that graph. If you're living at very low difficulty, you can compute where the fastest network is. It's 2W of a half over A lambda. This is remarkably independent of network topology. So let's look again at this graph here. This is the red line. So even if I'm way over here on the left in the blockchain limit, and I'm living with 10-minute blocks, I can still compute what the location of this is. In other words, what this means is we can create a zero parameter retargeting algorithm that targets the fastest possible block time. Satoshi chose 10 minutes. Why did he choose 10 minutes? It's arbitrary and it's slow. And the reason he chose 10 minutes is exactly because of this problem. You don't want the block time to be too fast or you generate a whole ton of orphans. So 10 minutes was chosen so that it's slow enough that it doesn't run into this problem. But we are getting to the point where Bitcoin is scaling to the level where we can't avoid this problem anymore. We can't pretend the network is synchronous. We have to actually deal with it. So I can take the parameters here, looking at Bitcoin, and I can evaluate these quantities using Bitcoin. So over the last 2 years, Bitcoin has had an average orphan rate of 1.16 orphans per day at its target block time of 600 seconds. And using that, I find that this parameter A is about 4.79 seconds. And the cohort time, the minimum is about 11.6 seconds. So if we were to do this, if we were to target this block time, we would automatically compensate for network topology changes. So another point is that the network cannot measure time more accurately than A. That's fundamentally what's going on here. The network is asynchronous and it has a certain size. And fundamentally, it can't come to consensus faster than roughly the size in time of the network. This implies that it can't make state transitions faster than A, meaning it can't change difficulty faster than A. If one side of the network changes difficulty, and then 4.79 seconds later, the other side of the network hears about it, that's 4.79 seconds where somebody may have produced an invalid block with respect to this change. The network also can't change its reward function faster than A. So in order to be a truly asynchronous network, what we should do is actually have a range of acceptable targets. In other words, by having a range, you can smoothly transition through a change and allow that change to propagate across the network. And the same goes for rewards. Bitcoin's reward schedule looks like the following. The rewards as a function of time is the initial reward, R0 to 50 Bitcoins, times an exponential function. So it's an exponentially decaying reward. Now, Satoshi chunked this up so that it halves every 4 years, but if I were to turn this into a continuous function, this is what it is. Now, at the very beginning, the uncertainty on time of 4.79 seconds corresponds to an uncertainty on the reward of about 132 Satoshis. So in other words, what we could do in principle is allow blocks to write their own reward plus or minus 132 Satoshis. This would allow us to make reward changes without actually creating any orphans. it's very unlikely, but you know, when we make a reward change, the halving that's coming in a couple of weeks here, it's possible to have an orphan on top of that. So again, this is something else that Satoshi slowed down. He didn't. If he had changed the reward every block, some blocks would have the wrong reward. So he slowed down the retarget of the reward as well. However, if we accept the fundamental asynchronicity of the network, and we measure that asynchronicity, we can translate that asynchronicity into any other parameters we need to, like the difficulty and like the reward. So that's my presentation summary here. So we presented code and algorithms which allow blocks to have multiple parents, thereby allowing miners to both validate an incoming block and mine a new one at the same time. This is probably the major contribution of this, is the algorithms which allow us to, which will allow us to organize blocks into a chain. It does, the way I've done this, it does so without any additional assumptions. The only thing going on is that blocks have multiple parents. And the UTXO set naturally occurs where we can have everybody that came before as an ancestor and everybody that comes after as a descendant. This is the definition of a cohort. I suggest that all blocks satisfying the proof of work condition should be accepted to the main chain. In other words, this is equal pay for equal work. Because if there's an asymmetry, there's a game. And if there's a game, somebody can find an algorithm to play that game, and it will be at the detriment of the security of the system. So we're really better off making sure every time somebody produces a valid hash value, they are compensated on the chain. And I think we must find an alternative to Satoshi's highest work chain. I don't think it makes a whole lot of sense to be using blocks that are worth $15,000 each to be deciding among double spends, which are worth only pennies. Finally, we suggest that consensus rules should allow for a range of target and reward values. And we accept the fundamental fact that the network is asynchronous and has a consensus time of A. This goes back to the problem of latency and the eight fallacies of distributed computing. This is perhaps, in my mind, one of the best arguments that Satoshi was actually a human being. He, she, or they made this mistake that apparently a lot of people who approach distributed systems do. All right, that is all.
So let's open up to questions. You can post questions either through the Q&A box or the chat box, and we'll see if we can get Bob to answer them.
All right, so we have, there's some stuff in the chat which I'll get to. Please go to the Q&A and ask a direct question if you'd like me to answer it. Chronos Crypto asks, assuming we could, with no effort, instantly transform the Bitcoin network to this new architecture, what do you think would be the biggest downside? I don't really know that there's any downside. I mean, it's taken me quite some time to figure out exactly what to do with this, because having a graph structure implies a lot more choices to be made. It's more complex. And understanding what's going on with the graph, I've been through several iterations of this. And I've landed here on something which is actually quite simple. One thing you might think of is that you have to find a way to order your transactions. And here, basically, I found a way that I don't actually have to. I can let the graph structure do it for me, and thereby arrive at something that has a minimum of assumptions. I think maybe the biggest drawback is that this is going to be a difficult transition. This is not a small perturbation. It's not a small change. And this goes back to the original quote by L. Peter Deutsch. These assumptions about the fallacies of distributed computing ultimately prove false, resulting in either the failure of the system or a substantial reduction in system scope, or in large unplanned expenses required to redesign the system to meet its original goals. And I think that's where we stand. This is an unplanned expense, an unplanned expansion, but we have to do it. And if we don't do it, essentially Bitcoin is going to collapse under its own success. Andrew Stone asks, if machines can't handle more than X transactions in a block, and you post multiple blocks exceeding X transactions, how can a machine keep up? This is related to the question that was asked of the previous speaker. Like, are we going to be able to mine or continue running nodes on Raspberry Pis forever? I think the answer to this is no. I mean, clearly, once you get to Visa scale and you're processing 50,000 transactions per second, you can't possibly handle that load. There is, in my mind, two things that have to happen to bring scaling to Bitcoin. One is the braiding thing that I've talked about here. But the second thing is we have to figure out a way to shard the transaction set. Having every node hold every transaction doesn't scale. This is the biggest impediment to scaling. There are not really any great proposals I have heard yet about how to shard the blockchain, but this is the other major thing we need. So that's also a giant change that we're going to have to face at some point. Free Trader asks, can you prove that your algorithm can find cohorts regularly in real-life sizes on the network? Yes. Basically, the graphs I have shown you contain millions upon millions of cohorts. The error on the vertical error bars on that, it's the square root of the number. So the very smooth graph I showed you has literally hundreds of millions of cohorts in it. It took me quite some time to find this algorithm. It's a little bit difficult, and I chose not to explain it in the talk because it's kind of a mind bender. But the algorithm is absolutely solid. It finds cohorts every single time. One drawback to it is that as the size of the cohort grows, the amount of time it takes to find the cohort grows as well, and it grows as a polynomial. So if you look at the graphs I have on the far right side, I'll switch back to one of them here. There we go. On the far right side, the cohorts are becoming large. At the minimum, cohorts have on average about 2 beads. So in general, you're almost always producing another bead in parallel. As we go to the right, we get up to 50, 60, 100 beads. The amount of time to find the cohort grows as a polynomial in the number of beads in the cohort. So we can't actually allow ourselves to get to the far right side because the computation time just to find the cohort grows. We really want to live at the minimum of this. And when the cohort size is only 2, it costs essentially 0 time. The time to find a cohort is literally milliseconds. So the code is very fast, and I hope it is used widely. All right, Chronos Crypto asks, do you think this architecture would bring Bitcoin security back up to 51%, negating the selfish mining attack, or would there still be some kind of block withholding attack that would work? Block withholding doesn't do you any good. Basically, the reason the block withholding attack works is because of the asymmetry between the miner who wins a block and the miner who does not. If both miners receive the reward, regardless of when their block appears, there's no incentive to withhold the block. There's nothing to be gained. Blocks will be delayed. There are a lot of reasons that a block might be delayed. And I think that should not cause the miner to lose out on creating that, on receiving the reward. If a miner in good faith produces a reward and it gets stuck in some network hole somewhere, this isn't really a problem for the system. We can tie it up. One of the things I actually omitted from this was the fact that you can tie together chains that have been separated for a long time. In other words, when you can name multiple parents, you can allow the network to be split for quite some time, which you might call a block withholding attack. You might also call it dredging an undersea cable. But we can bring merging of blockchains together with this technology also. Free Trader asks, have you written up the analysis as a paper already? No. You can find a write-up with this analysis on my GitHub. There's an example Python worksheet there in the Jupyter, formerly IPython, with the math and some more description of it. This will be written up and published in the Ledger Journal as soon as I find enough time to get finished writing it all. Chronos Crypto asks, on average, how many seconds would pass between blocks on the Bitcoin network if it ran at the optimum point? So this is 11 point, I think it was 11.6 seconds. Now, keep in mind, this is a measurement of the Bitcoin network itself. We're actually using the orphan rate to determine this. This is probably a lower bound. Let's see, where is it? Because there are probably a number of orphans which never got reported. I got this data from blockchain.info, and so this is the orphans that they have seen. And where'd it go? Yeah, about 24. Yeah, so this A parameter is 4.79 seconds, and the cohort time at the minimum is 11.64 seconds. Again, by dynamically retargeting, this would allow us to handle a number of interesting cases. People are currently mining over Tor. Tor is not a great anonymizing network. There are better technologies out there, and new anonymizing networks may appear, and there may be good reason to add latency. At the same time, there may be good reason to let people mine faster than that and propagate their blocks faster. So what we can do here is actually measure latency of the network and take it as a measurement rather than having a parameter. You know, Bitcoin takes the 10 minutes, and this is a hard and fast parameter that's completely arbitrary. I don't know why it should be 10 minutes. Why not 11? Why not 9? So we can completely remove that parameter and instead measure how the network is behaving. Chronos Crypto asks, it seems impossible to get from here to there in terms of network forking for this to change. What are your thoughts on real-world challenges of making this happen? My thoughts are, A, let's see if this idea works. So the next few steps here, I'm going to be building a test net. I'm currently porting this code and the algorithms to C++ and trying to figure out how to, what I'm working on now is trying to figure out how to merge long separated forks. So as far as forking, I don't know. It's possible to take a set of beads and create a Bitcoin block out of them. In other words, if you create a smaller, faster network, it's always possible to take those transactions and reorganize them into a block that can be accepted by old Bitcoin nodes. But the fact of the matter is, this is probably a hard forking change. And you know, redesigning the network so that it is can handle the fact that it is asynchronous is going to be a hard forking change. That's just kind of tough luck. We're going to have to deal with a hard fork sooner or later. Christoph asks, does Ethereum's Ghost protocol deal with this problem at all? No. So what Ethereum's protocol does is it takes these, what would be orphans, and it calls them uncles. The transactions in the uncles are discarded, and the uncle receives a reward that, if I'm not mistaken, is 1/32 of a block reward. So there is still an asymmetry. In other words, if you create an orphan, you still are losing out, and there still exists a gain. So there is a way to take that, the uncles, and do something analogous to selfish mining and gain more reward. The only way out of that trap is to actually give all blocks the same reward, according to the proof of work, equal pay for equal work. The Ghost protocol is not a graph structure. It is a chain structure. It just weights the orphans, essentially. Keeps track of the orphans and weights them.
Hi, Bob. There's a couple of questions in the chat, and I think they're being posted by panelists because they can't use the QA box. If you want to take a quick look at them.
Sure. Alex K asks, if we want to validate multiple blocks, what if miners skip the validation and favor those pesky milliseconds? So this is essentially it's the whole problem here, right? We have people, what's the word I'm looking for? Some of the miners are SPV mining, or they might choose to SPV mine. And there's an incentive to do this because of this problem of latency. So if they could mine and validate at the same time, they wouldn't have to make this choice. It's a catch-22 for them, right? Either they lose a block because it gets an orphan, or they lose blocks because they haven't validated the block that came previously. So by doing this and by allowing blocks of multiple parents and allowing us to validate and mine at the same time, we remove the catch-22 for the miners. Miners should validate every block. And if we remove this catch-22, I don't really see any reason why miners would choose not to validate blocks. It doesn't make any sense for them. They only lose by not validating blocks. They don't gain anything. Today, because of this, the latency problem, they do actually gain by SPV mining. Ricardo asks, have you considered implementing this in a new or existing altcoin or sidechain so that provides a test bed that actually has incentives? That's what I'm working on now. The next step is to port this to C++ and actually put it into a coin, run a testnet. I encourage you all, if you're interested, to take a look at the code. And there's some difficult questions to ask about incentives and how do we actually shuffle the transactions between beads, things like that. Those are the next steps, and definitely that's where this is going to go, because we need to test it before we actually, make a pull request to Bitcoin or something like that. There's a lot of chat here. If people have questions they want me to answer, could you repost them? Paul asks, is it not true that to prevent forks, the difficulty change must be very slow? To be comparable to Bitcoin, it must take 10 minutes to propagate new difficulty. The amount of time to propagate information across this network is that A parameter. It's 4.79 seconds. It's not 10 minutes. The difficulty change, so what I propose here is that the difficulty change could be continuous. And there's a window. So there's a window of rewards and a window of difficulties which are accepted by the network. On one side of the planet, they might have one view of the current difficulty or current allowed reward. On the other side of the planet, they might have a different view. And that difference is that 4.79 seconds. So by taking the reward function, which I'll flip to the slide here, by taking this reward function, so this is a continuous function. So I can take this A parameter, and A defines a window of time. And I can turn that into a window of reward, and I can turn that into a window of difficulty. So the change is exactly as slow as designed. It's this exact same halving, which is 4 years, as was put in by Satoshi. And that's using the latency of the network to decide how fast that changes. Or rather, the size of the window. The latency of the network decides the size of the window, in other words. I'm looking for more questions here. Is there a way to game the system by validating less? No. You only lose by not validating, because you may be mining on top of something which is invalid. All right, that is all the questions I see. If you have any more. Kronos Crypto asks, do you think transaction sharding is impossible? Could you elaborate a little bit? What is transaction sharding? How to not have each node process every transaction. I certainly don't think it's impossible. I have a number of ideas myself to do it, and after I finish this Braid project, that's what I'm going to be turning to. It's a difficult problem, though, because you can think about sharding using the UTXO set. You can think about sharding using blocks. The previous speaker mentioned a mechanism whereby each node doesn't hold the whole history. They only hold a subset of blocks, and if you want to get the whole history, you're going to have to go ask a bunch of different nodes to receive a subset of blocks. That is a different kind of sharding. In that case, everybody has to have the whole UTXO set. The difficult problem there is, how do I know that the UTXO set, so let's say we shard according to the UTXO set, right? So I'm going to hold, UTXOs with transaction IDs starting with 0 through 1. So I take like 1/16 of the whole transaction set. Now, the question is, how do I know that the rest of the UTXO set is consistent? There's a very simple way to do this. Peter Todd has brought it up a few times, and that is that you can actually attach to a transaction a proof that it is unspent, that its inputs are unspent. However, those proofs are roughly logarithmic in the size of in the depth of the chain, or the depth of the UTXO set rather, and it requires UTXO set commitments. That's something I forgot to mention, but one of the things we really would like to bring to Bitcoin is UTXO set commitments, so that this would create much more secure light wallets, like clients. And creating and validating UTXO set commitments is quite time consuming. Bram Cohen has been spending an awful lot of his time trying to make a highly optimized Merkle tree implementation in order to make UTXO set commitments. Why is he working so hard trying to make it highly optimized? Because this gets inserted in the validation step, and it slows down the validation. So it hits directly on this problem of latency. Because the latency is not properly accounted for in Bitcoin, we can't afford to insert something in the validation step, which makes validation take longer. So coming back to your question, one simple way to do it would be to attach proofs with some kind of UTXO set commitment to each transaction. This requires a lot more data to be transmitted around. It's an idea that would work, but people don't like it for various reasons, and I haven't actually tried to do it. I don't think anybody's actually tried to do it, but I'm absolutely confident that we will be able to do this. If for some reason we are able to find a way to do zero-knowledge proofs, we could do the same thing with zero-knowledge proofs, and that would cut down on the data that has to be transmitted around. But yes, that is the other big thing we have to figure out, is sharding for scaling.
Cool. So I think that kind of wraps up the amount of time we have. Let's all thank Bob in our silent applause. And we will have a 5 or actually about 7.5 minute break until the next session. So thanks again, Bob, and see everybody in a little bit.
Thank you very much, folks.